How's it going, guys? Thank you all for joining me today. So, recently someone brought to my attention a new video from a dude whose channel is called What I've Learned. Now, I have heard of this channel only because I remember the YouTuber Unnatural Vegan did several videos exposing him as a promoter of pseudoscience who likes to cherry-pick research, misinterpret data, and he doesn't even read his own sources as he constantly fearmongers about plants and then exaggerates the benefits of a high-fat and low-carb lifestyle. He also has the tendency to invite guests onto his show who have a clear conflict of interest, which he doesn't ever bother disclosing. But beyond that, my impression of his channel is he's mostly focused on promoting a low-carb, high-fat lifestyle, and he's been pretty damn successful at that, as he has about 2 million subscribers. So anyone who is lucky enough to get to speak on his channel is going to have a huge platform to reach out to many, many people. That is why it is especially unfortunate that he's decided to shift the focus of his channel to discussing the subject of hair loss. So, as far as I know, what I've learned, he's never actually discussed hair loss on his channel before, so he's built up a following based on content that is completely unrelated to hair loss. Therefore, there is a very good chance that many of his viewers are laymen on the subject and will believe whatever his channel tells them about it. So, out of all the people he could have possibly invited to help introduce his audience to hair loss, he chooses perhaps the worst person imaginable, Rob England. This would be like if he decided to make a fitness video and invited Jason Blaha to speak on his channel. So, Rob England from Perfect Hair Health had a great opportunity here to provide genuine quality information to many potential hair loss newcomers. Instead, he squandered this opportunity and decided to piggyback off a larger channel's success and plug his own bullshit, debunked theories about hair loss, as well as promote his business, which is to sell subscriptions to his website where he promotes pseudoscience combined with just enough legitimate science to give his content the veneer of legitimacy. So to give some background about this Rob England gentleman, he and I are actually pretty good friends, and that's despite the fact that we've had some pretty strong disagreements about hair loss research. Specifically, Rob England, despite not being directly adversarial to conventional hair loss treatments like Finasteride and minoxidil, is still an open promoter of debunked and obsolete theories about treating hair loss, which he uses to market his business. Most notably, Rob England is an active promoter of what is known in the scientific community as the blood flu theory. Now, I created a few videos responding to Rob England politely, explaining why I think the blood flu theory is wrong not just in practice, but even in theory, and this has unfortunately led to disagreements between us, which have sometimes escalated to the points where it has threatened our good friendship, such as this one time he threatened to sue me when I gave him the prestigious honor of joining the likes of people like HairGuard and Androgen in my Worst of the Hair Loss Industry series, and I'll link all those videos below in case you haven't seen them yet. So, no hard feelings about any of that, Rob. I understand and I know you deleted that comment where you threatened to sue me, so I suppose that can only mean that you feel bad about having written it, but that's okay, dude. I accept your apology. So, I thought I had gotten through to Rob England in my last confrontation with him, as most of his recent content has been pretty run-of-the-mill hair loss advice. Nothing extraordinary, but also nothing that could mislead people into following advice that could cost them their hair, so no big deal there. So I was especially disappointed to find out that Rob England is back to his same old dirty tricks again by promoting all the same old debunked nonsense we've been over together, and he's doing it on What I've Learned's channel, who has over 2 million subscribers, or close to 2 million subscribers. It's clear he did this to take advantage of What I've Learned's massive subscription base, and I find it especially unethical that he has exposed potentially millions of people to a false debunked theory that he is desperately trying to revive just for the sake of profit. Now, it gives me no pleasure to have to call you out again, Rob, and if it means anything, I am much more angry at What I've Learned than I am at you for giving such a huge platform to you to spread so much bro science, but I have a duty here to protect people from the bullshit channels like yours and What I've Learned spew, because I myself was a victim of similar misinformation back in the day, which caused me to hesitate with legitimate treatments, which put me into a position where I had to spend well over $10,000 on hair transplants just to get back a semblance of my original hairline. That would have never happened had I just had access to good information and wasn't exposed to the false hope people like you provide. I don't want anyone else to go through this, and as pissed off as I am about this video's existence, I intend to put all of my own personal feelings aside and rely strictly on evidence-based research to explain why the things you are saying are completely wrong. So, it's time to oil our blades, drink our potions, and go bald balls deep because we've got a monster of a video to slay, so let's get to it.
Rob came up with an interesting hypothesis for why hair loss happens that addressed a couple of unexplained phenomenon seen in balding scalps.
No, Rob, you did not come up with this hypothesis. The Blutflow theory is one of the oldest theories of hair loss, and the only reason it was ever taken seriously is because it was invented during a time when we didn't have tools to measure things like hormones, which we now know today are the real culprits of androgenic alopecia. In fact, the Blutflow theory is so archaic and obsolete that it was debunked over a century ago. It was debunked in 1916, in fact, by a scientist who was old enough to be Rob England's great-great-grandmother named Dorothy Osborn. So Dorothy Osborn was a scientist who published the first paper showing that androgenic alopecia was a genetic condition and that the Blutflow theory, back then just simply known as the blood flow theory, was complete nonsense. Back in those days, literally all men wore hats, and who can blame them? They didn't have finasteride minoxidil back then, so if you got androgenic alopecia, your only choices were to wear a hat or just shave it, brethren! One of the types of hats that was most popular back then was the fedora. Believe it or not, there was a time when wearing a fedora was actually considered cool. But one characteristic of fedora and other popular hat styles back then was that they had tight headbands so they wouldn't get blown off by the wind. So one of the major theories of hair loss back then was that tight headbands restricted blood flow to the scalp. Even more than that, just as people like Paul Taylor claimed that the shape of the skull determines the severity of hair loss, the blood flow fanatics from over 100 years ago felt that the interaction between the shape of the head and hats caused baldness. As Miss Osborn says about the theory, quote, "Not baldness itself, but the shape of the head is inherited, and in wearing hats, the consequent pressure on the blood vessels nourishing the scalp causes the loss of hair," unquote. Well, in this very, very old article, Dorothy Osborn showed that baldness runs in families and is clearly a genetic condition. There were families where baldness were completely absent, and others with lots of family members who were bald, and this was totally independent of people wearing hats. She even noted that the pattern of baldness did not match where the hat band was constricting blood flow. So even back when we were still fighting World War I, scientists had a firm enough understanding of human anatomy and physiology to understand that impingement of blood flow was not the reason for hair loss. Now, there have been a lot of new studies on this subject since 1916, as you might imagine, but as it turns out, these studies only further reinforce the fact that factors like blood flow, scalp tension, and skull shape have no bearing on the genesis of androgenic alopecia whatsoever. I just wanted to show this article to demonstrate that Rob's theory is definitely not his, and Rob isn't bringing anything new to the table here.
In fact, the paper he wrote on this was accepted into an academic journal.
So what I've learned brings up that Rob had his theory published in a medical journal called Medical Hypotheses. Later on, Rob includes this specific journal as one of the peer-reviewed journals where he has had papers published.
And as of today, I've published 4 peer-reviewed publications on one of the most common types of hair loss that you can be diagnosed with as an adult.
The problem is that Medical Hypotheses is not a peer-reviewed journal. It is a pay-to-publish journal costing $1,850 to publish just one article, and it is ranked in journal ranking numbers as 11,208. I didn't even know that number of medical journals existed, so it's got to be pretty close to the bottom. Not only that, it has also published really bizarre articles like the effect of masturbation on nasal congestion, and the journal got into hot water for publishing articles that denied the existence of AIDS HIV. Perhaps not surprisingly, this is also where Rob England's buddy, Paul Taylor, published his hilariously stupid article claiming skull expansion causes hair loss, and I made a video debunking that, which I'll link below. So I don't know why Rob England would consider this to be a flex of some sort. As far as credentials go, it's actually pretty embarrassing. Now, as the average YouTube viewer, you might think that publishing 4 medical articles is in fact impressive, but you should realize here that real career scientists who have the credentials to theorize about hair loss usually have published several hundred academic articles. So Rob is overhyping his background, and I know people may react by saying, "Oh yeah, Kevin? Well, what are your credentials?" Okay, well, let's try to put things into perspective for a moment. Me? What I'm trying to do, I am just trying to present the medical consensus on various things. You don't need to have any credentials in order to do that. You only need to know how to interpret research. I am not trying to refute the accepted theories behind hair loss, nor am I trying to resurrect an ancient debunked theory like the blood flu theory. I am just coming from this from the same perspective as the rest of you guys. I am a consumer, and being that hair loss is one of the biggest scam industries to ever exist, as consumers, it is our responsibility to be skeptical. That is all I am trying to do here.
Also run the website perfecthairhealth.com, which showcases evidence-based approaches for hair regrowth with the drug model and without the drug model. It doesn't really matter to me which path somebody takes. What matters is that they're getting access to good information.
So it's clear what Rob is doing here is presenting a false hope. On his website, he repeatedly says that hair loss can be treated with or without drugs. This may be an appealing thought, but it is completely false. There is no means of regrowing hair outside of the drug model. Even hair transplantation surgery doesn't actually give you any new hairs. It just moves hair from one region to another. So Rob's business model is based on the notion of, hey, I don't care about your preferences. My job is just help give you the knowledge you need to regrow your hair. But the problem is you should care about their preferences because that's kind of a big deal here. If someone were to come up to me and ask me for advice on how to build muscle without exercise or using steroids, I'd tell him he's shit out of luck. I'd say the same thing to someone who asked me for advice on how to regrow hair without using pharmaceuticals. Maybe it's not what they want to hear, but it is the truth. And the fact that you take liberties with truth for the sake of your business is unethical because people who see your website will be convinced that either approach has merit, which isn't true. And even you yourself say later in the video that the level of evidence behind scalp massages as a hair loss treatment is very low, yet here you are outright claiming scalp massages can treat hair loss. You know that's not true. Now, Rob would probably counter this by saying he doesn't claim that the drug and non-drug models are equal. However, when you have text on your website like this that says, quote, hair regrowth is possible with and without drugs, unquote. The implication here is that either approach is totally reasonable and basically equal or at least comparable in efficacy, when the reality is that scalp massages have not been shown to work at all. In fact, while promoting scalp massages, what I've learned even makes fun of laser therapy.
These lasers that are helping you restore your hair, and it can be under a beautiful, fashionable hat.
So no doubt, things like laser helmets, which are also known as low-level laser light therapy or LLLT, are largely considered to be jokes by most hair loss veterans. However, even laser therapy has much more evidence backing its efficacy than scalp massages, and I say that as someone who has strongly criticized and made several videos bashing low-level laser light therapy as a treatment that I'll link below. In laser therapy's defense, though, there is evidence suggesting that it helps a little bit. The problem is the results are so low that it is often not even cosmetically noticeable. But these results are still better than scalp massages, where it's been shown that if anything, it might actually make hair density worse, as you can see in this graph from a Japanese randomized control trial that compared scalp massages to placebo and found a significant decrease in hair density after 12 weeks of scalp massage, and certainly no improvement over placebo. So clearly, you're in this not to emphasize what's been proven to be effective, which of course is drug therapy. What you're doing is you're trying to attract people who are afraid to take finasteride, and rather than tell them the red pill reality that they have no choice, you offer them this false blue pill alternative, which means they're going to be losing both their hair and their money by listening to you.
But the reality is that there's some things that have yet to be explained by researchers in terms of how this condition advances. And I can give you a couple examples. So there's obviously a very strong genetic and androgenic basis to androgenic alopecia, but nobody really knows why DHT begins to increase in balding scalps.
I am afraid this is only a mystery to Rob England, and soon we're going to see him present this convoluted theory that there is an increased amount of inflammation in the scalp and that this somehow attracts DHT to the scalp and progresses androgenic alopecia. However, it has already been well established that in the hair follicles of balding scalps, there is increased levels of the 5-AR enzyme, which converts testosterone into the trash hormone DHT. People with androgenic alopecia also have more androgen receptors on their scalp hair, so the combination of increased DHT as well as increased androgen receptor activity results in the destruction of the hair follicle. This is all determined by genetics, and it is not due to the local environmental factors like scalp tension or blood flow, because there have been experiments done where hairs that are harvested from balding regions of the scalp are then transplanted to non-balding regions such as the forearm or the back of the head, and those hairs were shown to continue to miniaturize at the exact same pace. This research dates back to the 1950s, and it helped establish the science behind hair transplants, since we know that hairs transplanted from non-balding regions of the scalp, such as the occipital region, will not miniaturize when transplanted to the front of the scalp. So, Rob and his followers may counter this by saying things like, oh, they actually do miniaturize sometimes, but the reason this happens is because of poor harvesting techniques, such as when the hairs are transplanted outside of the donor region, or in issues where the surgery is just poorly performed, which doesn't allow the transplanted hair follicle to recover from the trauma of surgery, which is what we see in places like cheap Turkish hair mills. The fact of the matter is, though, is that the whole hair transplant industry would not exist at all if hair transplants didn't work. And the only reason why they are able to work is because of genetic determinism, which protects transplanted hairs from the trash hormone DHT. Where those hairs are located on the scalp doesn't matter, provided the transplantation is performed well.
Why individuals who are undergoing hair loss and then completely reduce that hormone DHT, why do we only see a stop in the progression of pattern hair loss rather than a full cycle hair regrowth where our hair density returns to complete normal?
So what Rob is trying to do here is say something like, oh, even if you completely suppress DHT, some people will still go bald. So clearly DHT is only part of the equation here. This is completely misleading because not even the strongest 5-AR inhibitor on the planet will completely eliminate DHT from the scalp. Even 2.5 milligrams of dutasteride used daily, which is 5 times the standard dose, will only suppress scalp DHT by about 80%. Even if theoretically you could suppress 100% of the 5-AR enzyme, it still wouldn't completely eliminate DHT from the scalp or the body because there are backdoor pathways to producing DHT. And this is an important point to bring up, not just in the context of this video, but also to remind people that even though DHT is a trash hormone, even if I am wrong and someone could prove that there is some important role DHT serves that testosterone cannot already do better, the fact is taking a 5-AR inhibitor does not eliminate DHT completely. So even if there is some minimal role of importance DHT plays in the body in adulthood, you're not eliminating the hormone completely by suppressing the 5-AR enzyme. It's simply not possible. Also, Rob asked why suppressing DHT only stops hair loss but can't cause regrowth. This question is based on a false pretense though, because finasteride absolutely can regrow hair, and in some cases it can even regrow a substantial amount of hair. The initial clinical trials as well as the follow-up data both confirm that the majority of people who take finasteride will stop the progression of hair loss at 2 years in 83% of subjects, and will actually improve hair growth at 2 years in 66% of subjects. So that's not bad at all. How much regrowth you get will be based on factors such as genetic severity and just how far gone you are, but regrowth with finasteride can and does occur, and it can even continue to occur after 10 years of usage, and I made a video about that which proves that finasteride is extremely effective both in the short as well as the long term. So it's clear Rob is downplaying the effectiveness of finasteride so more people will buy into his bullshit ideas about alternative theories when it really is just as simple as suppressing the goddamn DHT. Now, there are going to be a very small minority of people where finasteride may not be enough because maybe they waited too long and simply have too much scar tissue, which has taken the place of healthy hair, or it could be their hair loss is so aggressive that they need a stronger 5-AR inhibitor like dutasteride. But let's cut the bullshit here. A 5-AR inhibitor is absolutely the best means of stopping hair loss, and it absolutely can reverse hair loss. So what Rob is saying here is completely wrong.
And then another thing that I think is well under-researched is the fact that DHT is strongly associated with hair loss in the scalp in men and women, especially in adults. But DHT is also this hormone that's strongly associated with beard growth in the face and chest hair growth.
Congratulations, Rob! You've discovered the androgen paradox. Welcome to 1981. What you're saying here is true, but it's not like everyone doesn't already know this. After all, what do 99% of men try to do when they go bald? They try to compensate for it by growing a nasty-ass beard, but all it does is make them look like they are growing their hair upside down. So, contrary to Rob's implication about some arcane mystery behind how androgens affect hair, there has been plenty of research on the subject, and it is very well understood. People who are genetically susceptible to androgenic alopecia produce more DHT on their scalp, and it has been shown that excessive DHT causes downstream effects, including suppressing the WNT Wnt pathway, which is critical for hair growth.
And so when we start to zoom out, we notice that it's not just DHT.
No, Rob, it really is just DHT. I know telling people to use proven treatments doesn't make for a good business model for your subscription service, but it is the truth here. There are even populations of people who have genetic mutations where they do not produce the 5-AR enzyme, and guess what? 0% of them have hair loss, so it really is just a matter of suppressing DHT. Now, there are other factors linked to DHT, like for instance, DHT also decreases IGF-1, which is a positive hair growth factor, and DHT also increases negative growth factors like TGF-beta-1. There are many biochemical processes that are involved in the destruction of hair follicles, but they are all intrinsically linked to the presence of the trash hormone DHT on the scalp. So if you want to stop hair loss, you simply block the DHT. It's that easy. Now, there are some drugs in development that target some of these individual effects without directly blocking DHT, like the WNT Wnt pathway stimulants, and I have made videos on all of these treatments, which I'll link below if you're interested. But these are not commercially available yet, and their efficacy as well as their safety has not yet been established as they are still undergoing testing. Therefore, for the time being at least, 5-AR inhibitors are the best thing we have for fighting androgenic alopecia.
At tissue level, we see reductions to blood supply, and we also see reductions to oxygen.
Did somebody say blood flu? Well, he's going to get into that more later in this video, but rest assured, everything you're hearing coming out of this man's mouth is 100% bullshit, and I fully intend to explain why, so let's give him the chance to dig himself into an even deeper hole before I burn him with the Igni sign.
And the question is low blood flow a cause of that hair loss, or is it a consequence of hair loss? And there is some evidence to suggest that low blood flow actually might be a consequence of hair loss.
So here is Rob trying to come across as being fair and balanced, and this is something he does a lot because it gives the impression that he's actually open-minded and that he's really not pushing an agenda, but it really is just a way to cover his own ass since he'll always mix in legitimate science with research he likes to cherry-pick and often outright misrepresent in order to push his fraudulent marketing push. For example, after making this accurate statement about low blood flow being a consequence of hair loss, he then says this.
But there are also some research groups dating back to the 1990s that have argued that the reductions that we're seeing to blood flow in the scalp cannot be explained by these microvascular insufficiencies alone. There has to be some sort of potential anatomical trigger that is also contributing to the reductions in blood and oxygen.
Although in this paper the authors hypothesize that lower blood flow could cause hair loss, they also say that the opposite could also be true. Unlike what Rob claims, they do not say there, quote, has to be an anatomical trigger, unquote. This is something Rob imagined when he read the paper. What the investigators really said is, quote, we have documented this hypoxia, meaning low oxygen levels, but our study was not designed to test or prove the existence of a causal relationship between hypoxia and male pattern baldness, unquote. So Rob is just reading what he wishes the researchers concluded rather than what they really said. It's kind of like when a girl tells a bald guy she just wants to be friends, and then the bald guy interprets that as, I love you. The other study by Klemp that Rob shows but doesn't quote to support the blood flow theory has a similar warning. The investigators wrote, quote, however, we cannot conclude whether the reduced scalp blood flow is primary, secondary, or irrelevant for the etiology of early male pattern baldness from the present study, unquote.
If you talk to dermatologists who are really familiar with feeling people's scalps who have pattern baldness, they'll say that about 80% of the individuals that they see with pattern baldness have really, really tight scalps relative to their non-balding counterparts.
Is that what makes the scalp so shiny?
Is that what makes the scalp so shiny? I swear, this dork has to be related to Danny Roddy. I wonder what he thinks about aspirin and hair loss. But whatever the case, it's befuddling this dweeb somehow has amassed 2 million subscribers. But getting to the point here, people who are full-blown bald, let's say they're a Norwood 7, have lost all their hair follicles on the crown and vertex, and the healthy skin and capillaries supporting the hair follicles have all been replaced by scar tissue. Scar tissue is avascular, so the tissue loses its sponginess due to the fact that there's less fluid in the tissue, which is one of the reasons why the scalp feels tight. The other reason is because the tissue is made up of collagen, which is more plastic, meaning it doesn't retract as much when you stretch it. Also, there are fewer elastin fibers, and elastin fibers are the stretch elastic fibers which go back into place when you stretch them. So this goes back to the whole cause versus consequence argument. Bald men have a tighter scalp as a consequence of going bald. It isn't because of going bald, that is just a side effect of it.
You talk to these dermatologists and they say that, the scalp in men who are balding, 80% of these individuals have a very tight scalp, and that they seem to suggest that tension seems to arise mainly from this involuntary and chronic contraction of the scalp perimeter muscles that basically round the entire top part of the scalp and are anchored to this dense fibrous membrane that underlies balding-prone regions called the glia apparotica.
Okay. Who are the dermatologists making claims that the scalp is tight due to chronic contractions of the scalp perimeter muscles? What doctor actually believes this? Is it Dr. Trash? Anyways, I think this is something that Rob just came up with because it is fundamental to his whole business model that everybody who is bald is walking around with chronically tight scalp muscles that are inhibiting blood flow to the scalp. If there are any dermatologists who claim this, then remember that every medical field has its share of quacks. But even if what Rob is saying here is true, it doesn't matter because anatomically speaking, it isn't possible for scalp muscles to inhibit blood flow. The blood flow and glia apparotica theory is 100% false, not just in terms of outcome data, but even the theory is completely wrong, and there is plenty of evidence which confirms just that. First of all, Rob doesn't understand the anatomy of the scalp blood vessels. The blood vessels that supply blood to the hair do not run under or through the muscles of the scalp or through the glia apparotica. In fact, if you look at any anatomy chart, you can clearly see that the scalp blood vessels lie above the glia apparotica and scalp muscle layer and are just underneath the skin where they are located within adipose tissue, which is a very loose and mobile tissue which allows blood to pump through the arteries uninhibited. So factors like tight scalp muscles or a tight glia apparotica would not have any effect on the blood pathways of the scalp arteries. In fact, you can see in this figure that the superficial temporal artery, as the name would imply, is very superficial. It is so superficial, in fact, that you can see it underneath the skin. It is one of the very few arteries in the body you can actually see under the skin, in fact. The second point here is that there are several arteries that supply blood to the scalp, and these arteries are all interconnected. So even if one were obstructed, it would just cause the other arteries to compensate by just increasing the blood flow in those arteries. One reason we know obstructing the blood vessels does not cause hair loss is because there is a cosmetic surgical procedure where some people who don't like the way the superficial temporal artery looks on their forehead will have that artery ligated, meaning it is tied off completely. The surgeons who perform this surgery make the observation that despite this obstruction, no hair loss occurs afterwards, and this is because of the redundancy of the scalp vascular networks. You tie off one, the others will just compensate, so blood flow in the scalp will be exactly the same. You can almost think of it like a pipe that splits off into two pipes that has water running through it. If you were to block off one end, the water flow would just increase in the other pipe. Also, if Rob can get away with just quoting random unknown dermatologists to back up his claims, then I'll go ahead and report to you that emergency room doctors who have to treat scalp wounds will often say that scalp wounds bleed more than any other type of wound because the scalp is extremely vascular, and that includes bald scalps. So there's no way the hair follicles, which are really just tiny organs supported by microscopic capillaries, are not getting adequate blood or oxygen to survive. If that were the case, then the skin of the scalp would become necrotic and then die. So if hair loss really was caused by low blood flow, you wouldn't just see their scalp, you'd see their whole skull get exposed and the skin would slough off because of the low blood flow. But that never happens because in the body there is always sufficient blood supply to meet tissue demands. Finally, Even if Rob's thesis about blood vessels being impinged by tight muscles were true, it wouldn't matter in the slightest because massaging muscles does not increase blood flow, and this was proven in a study from 1997 from JK Shoemaker that is titled, quote, "Failure of manual massage to alter limb blood flow measured by Doppler ultrasound," unquote. Now, in case you haven't heard of a Doppler, we're not talking about the shape-shifting creature from The Witcher. What a Doppler is, it's basically just a medical instrument that is used to measure blood flow. Simple as that. Anyways, in this study, the investigators measured Doppler blood flow in the forearm and in the quadricep leg muscles before and after different types of massage. The bottom line from the study was, quote, "The results indicate that manual massage does not elevate muscle blood flow irrespective of massage type or muscle mass receiving the treatment," unquote. So what they are saying here is that regardless of the size of the muscle, massaging has no influence on blood flow, and that would apply even to small muscles such as those surrounding the scalp perimeter, where Rob claims that arteries are being pinched off, which, as we've already shown, isn't even true. So the blood flow theory isn't just wrong, it's awesomely wrong. It manages to be theoretically wrong on multiple fronts, such as being anatomically impossible as well as mechanically impossible. So you can't get much worse than that when it comes to failed theories. But it is nevertheless downright impressive just how awful this theory is. It leaves me feeling the same way I felt after watching Star Wars: The Rise of Skywalker. I couldn't be angry with how bad it was because of just how astonishing it was in its atrociousness. It wasn't just so bad that it was good, it was so bad that it was perfect. So I have to give the blood flow theory the Rise of Skywalker award, and I would credit you for it, Rob, if it weren't for the fact that you didn't even come up with it.
So in Dupuytren's contracture, it's this tendon-related condition where your tendons completely contract like this, and then your finger gets stuck. If you biopsy that tendon, you tend to see increases to 5-alpha reductase, you see increases to DHT, you see increases to transforming growth factor beta 1, you also see fibrosis.
So I don't know if Rob has any sources for these claims he's making, but if he does, then what I've learned didn't bother to list any of them, which isn't very convenient for people who want to fact check these claims. This is pretty important when you run a science-based YouTube channel, and that is why on my videos, I always list all of my sources, as you can see here in my last video. I couldn't find any data supporting his claims that biopsies of Dupuytren's tissues have elevated DHT or 5-AR enzyme. I did, however, find one article where TGF-beta1 was elevated, and there is data that androgen receptors are increased in the fibrous tissues affected by Dupuytren's. However, Dupuytren's contractions are not thought to be due to constant tension on the tendons, as Rob claims is what happens in the scalp. Rather, it is some kind of tendon abnormality of unknown mechanism that shortens the tendon and makes it impossible to straighten the finger. But this is not the same process as he claims happens in the scalps of people who have androgenic alopecia. This is just him throwing in data that superficially sounds like it's related to his scalp tension theory, when in reality it is completely different. Oh, and by the way, Rob, it's pronounced Dupuytren's, not Dupuytren's, so you're welcome. He then tries to expand this to other issues like the eyelids of people with Graves' disease, which is due to hyperthyroidism, but it's known that hyperthyroidism causes increased androgen levels, so it's not surprising that there are increased DHT tissue levels. It has nothing to do with tension in the eyeballs.
The same is true with prostates that are enlarged and thereby under chronic pressure. You see increased 5-alpha reductase activity in DHT, increased inflammation, increased transforming growth factor beta 1, in some cases fibrosis.
So this is a classic example of Rob England putting the cart before the horse, which he obnoxiously does all the time. Why does he think these prostates are enlarged to begin with? What causes prostate enlargement? It's DHT, obviously, which is why Finasteride is also FDA approved for the treatment of enlarged prostate. It's not like the prostate enlarges and then that causes DHT levels to go up. It's the exact opposite, in fact. So the fact that the DHT is increased in enlarged prostates has nothing to do with his scalp tension thing. DHT is the cause and not the result of prostate enlargement.
When you model the contraction of the frontalis and the occipital muscles, you pull those tightly. Fascinatingly, the tensile pattern that you generate across the top of the scalp perfectly aligns with the progression and the rapidity of male pattern hair loss.
So these diagrams showing patterns of scalp tension correlating with the progression of hair loss are very commonly brought up to promote the scalp tension theory, but there are details about these diagrams that Rob conveniently leaves out. First of all, these are not actual diagrams of scalp tension in actual human beings. These diagrams are based on a two-dimensional computer model which attempts to predict scalp tension, but this model has not been validated and obviously wouldn't perfectly correlate with a human scalp, since a scalp is of a three-dimensional origin, not a two-dimensional picture like we see in the diagrams. Furthermore, it isn't scientifically relevant, as at best it's just a correlation and it does not prove that scalp tension causes hair loss. This is just used to manipulate people into believing the scalp tension theory, which is why you see other scammers in the hair loss industry like HairGuard promote it so he can sell his repurposed blood pressure cuff as a hair loss treatment.
Yeah, they were getting improvements to hair counts just by relaxing these scalp perimeter muscles, just through Botox injections. And what they found is over a 10-month window, 75% of individuals responded favorably to Botox in terms of stopping or improving their hair loss. And they also found an 18% increase in hair counts overall.
So here we get to the Botox research, and I knew Rob was going to bring this up because this is the foundation for pretty much all of his research. He equates all the hair loss outcomes associated with Botox to scalp massages, since Botox just so happens to have muscle relaxing properties. Now, I've created several videos discussing this Botox theory, but the fact is that the potential regrowth properties of Botox have nothing at all to do with muscle relaxation and blood flow, and Rob is conveniently leaving out data that describes other more plausible mechanisms as to why Botox may help promote hair growth, and it has nothing to do with its muscle relaxation properties. It turns out that Botox inhibits TGF-beta1, which is a negative growth factor, so suppressing it promotes hair growth. In fact, one of the ways DHT destroys your hair follicles is by increasing the levels of TGF-beta1. This was all demonstrated in a study that Rob doesn't bring up here. So, as the investigators say in this study, quote, intradermal injection of Botox was effective against androgenic alopecia by inhibiting TGF-beta1 secretion in the hair bulb, which is thought to suppress follicular keratinocyte growth and changes in the hair cycle. Previous studies reported the use of intramuscular Botox injections to treat androgenic alopecia without elucidating the exact underlying mechanism. Considering the diffusion of the injected liquid Botox and the scalp anatomy, even the intramuscular injection may indirectly inhibit the secretion of TGF-beta1 from dermal papillary cells in the hair bulb, unquote. So regardless of whether Botox is injected intramuscularly or intradermally, if it is injected near the scalp, there will be enough diffusion of the Botox to affect TGF-beta1 levels and potentially promote hair growth. Now, Rob has argued with me that intramuscular Botox injected just a few inches from the hairline wouldn't effectively diffuse enough to affect the scalp directly. But remember, Botox is actually the most potent poison on the planet, meaning even just a few molecules of the stuff has lethal potency, so it doesn't take much of it to have an effect. And even with minimal diffusion of it into the scalp, it would likely affect TGF-beta1 levels. Considering just how powerful this substance is, it is ludicrous to think that its effects would be limited just to the local injection site. We're talking about a drug that can kill a grown man in doses as low as 1 to 3 nanograms. To give you some context of just how small of a dose that is, a nanogram is 1 trillionth of a kilogram, and your average human being weighs about 70 kilograms. So if someone could somehow create just 1 kilogram worth of the botulinum toxin, it would be more than enough to kill every human being on the planet 100 times over. Not exactly a substance that is going to be very picky about where it's injected. Rob is basically trying to make the argument that if Botox works, that must mean scalp massages work too, when the reality is that Botox's mechanism for hair growth has nothing at all to do with its muscle relaxation properties. And that's based on the assumption that Botox works at all for androgenic alopecia. The fact is that these are small studies, and in fact, there are reports of Botox actually causing hair loss. For example, this report here includes 5 women who developed hair loss after getting frontal Botox injections. So So Rob's thesis about Botox isn't just mechanistically incongruent with his scalp tension hypothesis, it is also based on the assumption that Botox even works at all, which hasn't been established, and in fact, as I've just demonstrated, there is conflicting data. So this is really weak sauce as far as research goes, and it's nothing nobody who prides himself as a medical editor should put so much confidence into.
But then people might be wondering, like, what causes it to get so tight? Like, do some people have really tight scalps and other people don't have tight scalps? And what's making it tight?
It's a great question. I mean, I'm sure that some of this is genetically predetermined to a high degree in the womb and then in early childhood development, depending on the amount that we chew, the way that our jaw develops.
So Rob here is attributing scalp tension to the way our skull develops, which he says is due to a combination of genetic and lifestyle factors, like how we chew. But as we've already discussed, all these factors are completely irrelevant. Circulation to the scalp is not impeded by physical structures in the skull, like the muscles or the shape of the jaw. I don't want to keep reiterating this point over and over again, but I have done 2 whole videos, one based on the skull shape and the other based on the jaw shape, and I explain in detail why both factors are inconsequential towards the progression of hair loss, and I'll link those videos below. But let's go on to see what Rob England and What I've Learned are going to talk about next. Who knows, maybe they'll bring up the broccoli theory.
Overall, I mean, there's this condition called polycystic ovarian syndrome in women that is often characterized by an overexpression of androgens. And it happens specifically in the ovaries, and these women develop male-like characteristics. So they'll develop hirsutism, which is facial hair growth. They'll also develop pattern hair loss. It's an androgenic influenced condition. But when you measure bone mineral density in their scalps itself, their skull bones have a higher bone mineral density.
So Rob England is trying to push the classic skull expansion theory, which is this nonsensical theory that basically just comes from this one guy named Paul Taylor, who one day decided to just look out a window, and then he came to the realization that bald people have more prominent looking skull shapes than people who aren't bald, which should be obvious since bald people will show more scalp than non-bald people. And just like Rob England, Paul Taylor also coughed up the $1,850 to get his own asinine skull expansion theory published way back in 2009 in the same medical hypotheses journal. Paul Taylor didn't take any measures at all to test his skull expansion hypothesis. All he did is he literally just went outside and then made an observation. And he even says this in his paper he published. But despite this, people like Rob England have actually cited Paul Taylor's work to support his blood flow theory. The bottom line, though, is that the skull expansion theory is just a repackaging of the blood flow theory. It's not only false, but even if it were true, it still wouldn't make any sense, since there is no way for the rate of skull expansion to outpace the growth of vascular networks. It's actually so bad, it's hilarious, and I made a video completely dismantling it, and I highly recommend you watch it, so I'll link it below. But I really sincerely believe that Paul Taylor's skull expansion theory should be brought up in university courses on how not to write a scientific paper, because it's just that bad. That's probably why it only got published in the bargain basement journal Medical Hypotheses, which ranks amongst the lowest in standards in scientific journals, not just on planet Earth, but probably in the entire Milky Way galaxy. Anyways, Rob England is confusing skull shape with bone mineral density, which is not the same thing. There are many things that can improve bone mineral density without altering the shape of the bone. One classic example of this is good old-fashioned resistance training. In sports medicine, there is a concept called Wolff's Law, which purports that applying resistance to the human movement system doesn't just build up skeletal muscle strength, but also improves bone mineral density. It doesn't change the shape of the bones, though, otherwise people would become taller or shorter when doing training, which isn't possible, because by adulthood, the epiphyseal plates of the bones have fused, which limit growth, and this applies to the bones of the skull as well. So when Rob England brings up polycystic ovarian syndrome, also known as PCOS, he's ignoring the more obvious explanation as to why women who have it develop hair loss. It's the same reason they develop other androgenic traits like facial hair. It is because of elevated androgen levels. That's it. If you were to give women exogenous testosterone, the exact same thing would happen. It's not because of skull changes, it's just higher DHT levels. That's it. So this doesn't support the skull tension theory at all, and Rob is once again trying to invoke mechanisms which aren't even theoretically possible.
there's a study by Dr. Goldman who measured transcutaneous oxygen levels in balding regions and found that in the frontal region of the scalp, where there was hair loss, there was about a 40% decrease to transcutaneous oxygen levels and very likely blood flow. And in that paper, he argued that dihydrotestosterone, DHT, is this hormone that occurs even in the absence of oxygen. And so when free testosterone can convert into something else, it can become an estrogen, like estradiol, and that conversion is oxygen dependent. You need moles of oxygen to create that conversion. But then for DHT, you don't need any oxygen. And his research group argued that maybe some of the reductions to blood flow and oxygen that we're seeing in balding regions are creating an environment whereby DHT might be favored and thereby expressing at higher levels.
So here we see Rob Englund circle back to the same paper he cited before on low oxygen levels in the scalp. So I guess he's back to the bread and butter of his business model, which of course is the blood flow theory. But this is Rob pulling out the big guns here. He's showing us the blood flow theory on steroids. So specifically, he's arguing it's not the lack of blood flow specifically that's killing your hair follicles. It's actually still DHT that is the culprit, since low levels of blood oxygen creates an environment where testosterone is more likely to convert into DHT, since the lack of oxygen prevents the aromatization of testosterone into estrogen, which is a benign or possibly even beneficial hormone for hair growth. So this conveniently ties the blood flow theory into the androgen hypothesis, so the blood flow theory has been effectively modernized for the 21st century since it no longer conflicts with existing research. Brilliant, isn't it? There are a couple of problems with this though, and the most obvious one is one Rob even admits himself, which is that low blood flow to the scalp is a consequence of hair loss, not a cause. When hair follicles miniaturize and die as a consequence of DHT, the healthy hair follicles get replaced by scar tissue, which is composed of collagen, which is largely avascular, so it requires less blood flow than hair follicles in order to survive. So bald scalps have less blood flow as a consequence of hair loss rather than low blood flow causing bald scalps. Interestingly enough though, that isn't the only problem with this theory. It turns out that low oxygen levels in the scalp can actually stimulate hair growth. In this Chinese study by Yi, it was found that conditions of low oxygen actually stimulated the growth of the dermal papillary cells. In fact, there is even a hair growth stimulant called stomachidine which works through this mechanism. It isn't as strong as minoxidil, but at the very worst, since it promotes hypoxia, then if Rob's thesis were correct, then stomachidine should cause hair loss rather than promote hair growth. Now, all of this isn't definitive, but it does suggest that the naive assumption that reduced blood flow causes hair loss is not necessarily true, even assuming that there is reduced blood flow prior to balding, which we've already established isn't true. But it does show that even hypothetically, this theory has more holes in it than Rob's scalp after microneedling.
The reason why I started Perfect Hair Health was because I had been doing these specific standardized scalp massages.
So I have heard Rob talk about his own personal journey and using scalp massages to reverse his own hair loss, and he definitely wasn't happy with my interpretation of his results. I won't go over that again because, I'd rather not get sued, but to sum up Rob's journey, he started balding when he was 17 years old, which means that he has very severe androgenic alopecia, as people who start balding as teenagers often become completely bald by their 20s. He never started finasteride because he was scared of the side effects, and he only used minoxidil for a few months before throwing it out. So in the past 14 or so years, he's maintained a full head of hair using only scalp massages. No 5-AR inhibitors, no growth stimulants, just scalp massages. Sorry, Rob, but that sounds like broccoli to me. However, since the last time he's brought up scalp massages, I do notice that he's changed his rhetoric about scalp massages and now attributes its effectiveness to an entirely new mechanism. Convenient, huh? Apparently, scalp massages work not just because of blood flow anymore, now it's because of scalp massages causing inflammation. So if one mechanism gets debunked, just imagine a different mechanism. So why did he just spend half of the video talking about the blood flow theory, you might wonder, if scalp massages aren't supposed to relieve the muscle tension and improve blood flow to the scalp? Well, one reason he may be changing the goalpost is the scientific evidence that we've already presented that massage in general does not in fact improve blood flow or help with hair loss at at all in any possible way. We already showed that in the Japanese study that showed that the massage group had worse outcomes, and we already showed that massage does not improve blood flow. So Rob can come up with new theories, such as saying that massage causes inflammation similar to what happens with microneedling, but the fact of the matter is he needs more than just his own personal hair loss journey experience to show that scalp massages has any efficacy as a hair loss treatment. So this is where he brings up the article he published on the effects of scalp massage on hair loss.
Then we launched a study, it's a survey-based study, to determine how people responded to these things over time.
Now, Rob England's study is based on a survey that he took from members of his own website who used his own scalp massage techniques. So we've already got some pretty clear issues of selection bias here. Anyone who thought they weren't benefiting from the Rob massages would have quit the website and then demanded their money back. Therefore, they certainly would not have been included in this study. So what we end up with here are a bunch of Rob England fanboys who are absolutely convinced that scalp massages are saving their hair, and Rob even brings up some before and after pictures of his clients. But without any proper control group put in place, there is no way anyone can attribute the results these people got to scalp massages. They could be getting results from other factors. They could be experiencing a placebo effect, or they could just be downright shills for Rob's company. Also, the results of the study are just based on each subject's self-assessment of their hair gains or losses. There were no hair counts done, and there was not even photographic assessments done by independent observers. So this study barely even qualifies as a study at all. Don't agree with me? Well, as it turns out, even Rob England himself brings up how poor all the data is in supporting his theory, but he only does it at the very end of the video after most people probably lost interest and gone back to watching TikTok videos.
The drug finasteride, the drugs minoxidil, dutasteride, these things are supported by tens of thousands of patients across 30 plus years of research. When we look at the data on these scalp massages, we have to contextualize the improvements based on the quality of research overall. We are talking about survey-based studies from self-reported individuals, which is the beginning stage of research, but it is absolutely not the gold standard for research. There were no hair count studies that were done on, these standardized scalp massages. So we have to interpret this survey data with a degree of caution and recognize that it's very, very low on the hierarchy of evidence.
So even though I do appreciate Rob England's honesty here at the very end, it's a bit of a case of too little too late. You should have disclosed all of this at the beginning of the video, or at least asked what I've learned to put a disclaimer in the description saying that everything you just said is complete bullshit. He also brings up repeatedly how everything he mentions is free, but he never says that the bulk of the information he's offering is locked behind a paywall, and he charges a king's ransom of $147 every 6 months to get access to his full content. But wait, there's more! For a measly $150 extra every 6 months, you get all of that, plus you also get a phone call with Rob English once per week. How can a phone call be that pricey? What is Rob England offering here? Phone sex? Also, he says you get a copy of his book every 6 months. So I guess every 6 months he sends you the same book, which I guess is cool if you have a spare bookshelf in your house that needs to be filled up or something. And hey Rob, look, I don't blame you for wanting to make money. Hell, I'm a salesman too, but you don't exactly come across as forthright about this subscription service in your interview with What I've Learned, which really makes you seem like you're lacking confidence in what you're offering, almost like you don't want to come forth and admit you're a salesman as opposed to a medical editor. You probably wanted to disguise the fact that this whole video you did with What I've Learned is nothing but a sales pitch for your business, and you've managed to convince a channel with 2 million subscribers to host what is essentially just a commercial for you, and who can blame you? It's free publicity, and that is why if I should be mad at anyone, it's What I've Learned for being so damn irresponsible as to host such pseudoscientific drivel on his tremendously huge platform that has no doubt at this point brainwashed thousands of his followers into believing your bullshit scalp massage has any benefit at all. What makes it especially bad is I myself run a very small YouTube channel, so I have no chance of reaching the same audience as someone like What I've Learned, but hopefully now, at least some of the people people who have been exposed to the dangerous misinformation What I've Learned has put on his YouTube channel will now come across this video and realize that despite the slick presentation and big production values, what Rob is selling here is a fringe, obsolete theory that he is desperately trying to revive for the sake of distinguishing himself in the hair loss industry so he can make a profit. The fact is, Rob, absolutely nobody benefits from what you are promoting except for you, and the few things you say that are true are not something anyone needs to buy a subscription service to your website in order to learn. Your attempts to present the scientific consensus on hair loss are tarnished by your constant agenda to push your own nonsensical theories alongside them, and you will continue to debase yourself so long as your work has an agenda to push fringe theories. You may be surprised to hear this, Rob, but I don't want to hurt your livelihood or your business at all. You know, I know you're a family man, so it doesn't make me feel good attacking you, but you have to understand something here. A lot of people who are new to the good fight against hair loss will come to my channel after being exposed to your misinformation. Therefore, they will ask my opinion about it, and therefore I am the one who has to clear things up. It was already bad before, but now it's going to get much, much worse since you are promoting these theories on a channel with 2 million subscribers. So admittedly, I am a little pissed off with What I've Learned for giving you such a huge platform, because now I have to clean up this huge mess that's been created between you two. Personally, Rob, I'd actually prefer to just let you be and let you do your own thing. After all, I am not the hair loss police who has to debunk every piece of bullshit that has ever been posted about hair loss online, but you are a public figure in this community, and therefore there are consequences to the shit you spew online, and there are consequences I imagine other hair loss YouTubers have to deal with too. So if you think I am being unfair to you, Rob, it is only because you are making my life worse. So please, please stop it. Thank you, and God bless.